emperor then discussed several points of political economy which are treated by Smith in his Wealth of Nations. He admitted that they were true in principle, but proved them to be false in application. Unfortunately, the scantiness of my notes here prevents me from entering into particulars. Formerly said he, only one kind of property was known, that which consisted in landed possessions. Afterwards, a second kind rose up, that of industry or manufacturers, which is now in opposition to the first. Then arose a third, that which is derived from the burdens levied on the people, and which, distributed by the neutral and impartial hands of government, might obviate the evils of monopoly on the part of the two others, intervene between them, and prevent them from coming into actual conflict. This great contest of modern times he called the war of the fields against the factories, and the castles against the counting houses. It is, said he, because men will not acknowledge this great revolution in property, because they persist in closing their eyes to these truths, that so many acts of folly are now committed, and that nations are exposed to so many disorders. The world has sustained a great shock, and it now seems to return to a settled state. The whole cause of the universal agitation that at present prevails may be explained in a few words. The ship's cargo has been shifted. Her ballast has been removed from the stem to the stern. Hence are produced those violent oscillations which may occasion a wreck in the first storm, if obstinate efforts are made to work the vessel according to the usual method, and without obtaining a new balance. This day has been rich in materials for my journal. Besides the subjects to which I have already alluded, several others were introduced. When speaking of India and the English East India Company, the name of Monsieur de Suffren was mentioned. The emperor had had no opportunity of forming a correct idea of the character of this officer. He had heard of his having rendered important services to his country, and for that reason alone he, Napoleon, had been very liberal to his family. The emperor questioned me respecting Suffren. I had not known him personally, and therefore I could only report what I had heard of him from other individuals in the Navy. It was admitted that since the time of Louis XIV, Monsieur de Suffren was the only officer who bore a resemblance to the distinguished men of the brilliant period of our Navy. Suffren possessed genius, invention, ardor, ambition, and inflexible steadiness. He was one of those men whom nature has rendered fit for anything. I have heard very shrewd and sensible persons say that his death in the year 1789 might have been looked upon as a national calamity. That he had been admitted to the King's Council in the critical moment, he might have brought matters to a very different result. Suffren, who was harsh, capricious, egotistical, and a very unpleasant messmate, was loved by nobody, though he was valued and admired by all. He was a man with whom no one could live on good terms. He was impatient of control, fond of condemning everything, and while he incessantly declaimed against the utility of tactics, he proved himself to be a perfect tactician. In short, he evinced all the irritability and restlessness of genius and ambition. Deprived of elbow room on obtaining the command of the Indian squadron, he went to take leave of the king, and one of the officers of the palace could with difficulty open a passage for him through the crowd. "I thank you," said he to the usher, grunting and snorting in his usual way, "but when I come out, sir, you shall see that I know how to clear the way for myself." And he spoke truly. On his arrival in India, he opened a new theater for the arms of France and performed prodigies which perhaps have not been duly appreciated in Europe. He set on foot measures and plans to command hitherto unknown, taking everything upon himself, hazarding all, inventing all, and foreseeing all. He broke and created his officers as he thought proper, fitted out and manned ships that had long been since condemned, and found a wintering station on the spot when, according to the old routine, the ships would have been obliged to sail to the Isle of France, a distance of 12 or 15 leagues. Finally, he broke through all rules, approached the coast, took on board troops who had been fighting the old enemy, and after they had assisted him in opposing the English squadron, he conveyed them back to their camp to resume the contest by land. Thus, the French flag assumed a superiority that disconcerted the enemy. "Oh," exclaimed the emperor, "why did not suffer and live till my time? Or why did I not light on a man of his stamp? I would have made him our Nelson. I was constantly seeking for a man qualified to raise the character of the French Navy, but I could never find one. There is in the Navy a peculiarity, a technicality that impeded all my conceptions. If I proposed a new idea immediately, Cantillon and the whole Marine Department were up against me. 'Sire, that cannot be. Why not? Sire, the winds do not admit of it.' Then objections were starting respecting calms and currents, and I was obliged to stop short. How is it possible to maintain a discussion with those whose language we do not comprehend? How often in the Council of State have I reproached naval officers with taking an undue advantage of this circumstance. To hear them talk, one might have been led to suppose that it was necessary to be born in the Navy to know anything about it. Yet I often told them that had it been in my power to have performed a voyage to India with them, I should on my return have been as familiar with their profession as with the field of battle. But they could not credit this. They always repeated that no man could be a good sailor unless he were brought up to it from his cradle, and they at length prevailed on me to adopt a plan about which I long hesitated, namely the enrollment of several thousands of children from 6 to 8 years of age. My resistance was vain. I was compelled to yield to the unanimous voice, while I assured those who urged me to this measure that I left all the responsibility with them. What was the result? An excited clamor and discontent on the part of the public, who turned the whole affair into ridicule, styling it the massacre of the innocents. Subsequently, De Winter, Verhuell, and all the great naval commanders of the North and others assured me that from 18 to 20, the age for the conscription, was early enough to begin to learn the duties of a sailor. The Danes and Swedes employ their soldiers in the Navy, with the Russians the fleet is but a portion of the army, which affords the invaluable advantage of keeping up a standing army, and for a twofold object. I had myself added he planned something of the kind when I created my crews for men of war. But what obstacles had I to encounter? What prejudices had I to subdue? What perseverance was I obliged to exert before I could succeed in clothing the sailors in uniform, forming them in their regiments, and drilling them by military exercise? I was told that I should ruin all. And yet, can there be a greater disadvantage or a greater advantage than for one country to possess both an army and a navy? The men thus disciplined were not worse sailors than the rest, while at the same time they were the best soldiers. They were, in case of need, prepared to serve as sailors, soldiers, artillerymen, pontooniers. If instead of being thus opposed by obstacles, I had found in the Navy a man capable of entering into my views and promoting my ideas, what importance might we not have obtained? But during my reign, I never found a naval officer who could depart from the old routine and strike out a new course. I was much attached to the Navy. I admired the courage and patriotism of our seamen, but I never found between them and me an intermediate agent who could have brought them into operation in the way I wished. The 7th, speaking of his imperial system, Napoleon observed that it had been the means of creating the most compact government, establishing the most rapid circulation in all its parts, and calling forth the most nervous efforts that had ever been witnessed. And nothing short of this said he would have enabled us to triumph over such numerous difficulties and to achieve so many wonders. The organization of the prefectures, their operations, and the results they produced were admirable. One and the same impulse was simultaneously communicated to more than 40 million men, and by the help of those centers of local activity, the movement was no less rapid and energetic at the extremities than in the heart itself. Foreigners who visited France and who were capable of observing and discerning were filled with astonishment to this uniformity of action prevailing over an immense extent of territory. Must be attributed those prodigious efforts and immense results which were accomplished to have been hitherto inconceivable. The prefects, with their local authority and resources, were themselves emperors on a small scale, as their whole power proceeded from the mainspring, of which they were only communicating channels, as their influence was not personal, but was derived from their temporary functions, as they had no connection with the district over which their jurisdiction extended. They presented all the advantages of the great absolute agents of the old system without any of their disadvantages. It was necessary to create this power, continued the emperor, for the force of circumstances had placed me in the situation of a dictator. It was requisite that all the filaments issuing from me should be in harmony with the first cause, or my system would have failed in its result. The network which I spread over the French territory required a violent tension and prodigious power of elasticity in order to make the terrible blows that were constantly leveled at us rebound to distant points. Thus, most of the springs of my machinery were merely institutions connected with dictatorship and measures for warlike defense. When the moment should have arrived for slackening the reins, all my connecting filaments would have relaxed sympathetically, and we should then have proceeded to our peace establishment and local institutions. If we yet possessed none of these, it was because circumstances did not admit of them. Our immediate fall would have been the infallible consequence had we been provided with them at the outset. It must not be supposed that the nation was all at once prepared to make a proper use of her liberty, both with respect to education and character. The bulk of the people were imbued with too many of the prejudices of past times. We were daily improving, but we had yet much to acquire. At the time of the revolutionary explosion, the patriots, generally speaking, were such by nature, by instinct. With them, patriotism was an innate sentiment, a passion, a frenzy, hence the effervescence, the extravagance, the fury that marked the period. But it is vain to attempt to naturalize and mature the modern system by blows jumps. It must be implanted with education and must take root with reason and conviction. And this will infallibly take place in course of time, because modern principles are founded on natural truths. But, added he, the men of our time were eager for the possession of power, which they exercised with a domineering spirit, to say no worse, while on the other hand they were ready to become the slaves of those who were above them. We have always wavered between these two extremes. In course of my journeys, I was often obliged to say to the high officers who were about my person, "Pray let the prefect speak for himself." If I went to some subdivision of a department, I then found it necessary to say to the prefect, "Let the sub-prefect or the mayor make his reply." So eager were all to eclipse each other, and so little did they perceive the advantage that might arise from direct communication with me. If I sent my great officers or ministers to preside at the electoral colleges, I always advised them not to get nominated as candidates for the Senate, as their seats were secured to them by other means, and I wished that they should resign the honor of the nomination to the principal individuals of the provinces. But they never conformed with my wishes. This reminded me of a misunderstanding that once took place between the emperor and the minister Decret on the subject here alluded to. The emperor, having expressed his pleasure at the nomination of the minister, "Sire," replied the latter, "your influence is more powerful than your will." I in vain resisted, and assured them that you wished these nominations to be made among themselves. They insisted on showing deference to your choice, and if you send me back, I shall only be nominated over again. I granted, said Napoleon, enormous salaries to prefects and others, but with regard to my liberality on this head, it is necessary to distinguish between what was systemic and what was incidental. The latter forced me to grant lucrative appointments. The former would ultimately have enabled me to obtain gratuitous services at the first outset, when the object was to conciliate individuals and to reestablish some kind of society and morality. Liberal salaries, absolute fortunes were indispensable, but the result being obtained, and in course of time, the natural order of things being restored, my intention, on the contrary, would have been to render almost all high public duties gratuitous. I would have discarded those needy individuals who cannot be their own masters, and whose urgent wants engender political immorality. I would have wrought such a change in opinion that public posts should have been sought after for the mere honor of filling them. The functions of magistrate, justice, of the peace would have been discharged by men of fortune, who, being guided solely by duty, philanthropy, and honorable ambition, would have afforded the surest pledge of independence. It is this that constitutes the dignity and majesty of a nation, that exalts her character and establishes public morals. Such a change had become indispensable in France, and the dislike of getting into place might have been considered the forerunner of our return to political morality. I have been informed that the mania of place hunting has crossed the sea, and that the contagion has been communicated to our neighbors. The English of former days were as much superior to this kind of meanness as the people of the United States now are. The love of place is the greatest check to public morals. A man who solicits a public post feels his independence sold beforehand. In England, the greatest families, the whole peerage, disdain not to hunt after places. Their excuse is that the enormous burdens of taxation deprive them of the means of living without additions to their income. Pitiful pretense. It is because their principles are more decayed than their fortunes. When people of a certain rank stoop to solicit public posts for the sake of emolument, there is an end to all independence and dignity of national character. In France, the shocks and commotion of our revolution might have afforded an apology for such conduct. All had been unsettled, and all felt the necessity of reestablishing themselves to promote this object with the least possible offense. To delicacy of feeling, I was induced to attach considerable emolument and high honor to all public posts, but in course of time I intended to work a change by the mere force of opinion, and this was by no means impossible. Everything must yield to the influence of power, and it is directed to objects truly just, honorable, and great. I was preparing a happy reign for my son. For his sake I was rearing in a new school the numerous class of auditors of the Council of State. Their education being completed, they would, on attaining the proper age, have filled all the public posts in the empire, thus confirmed in modern principles and approved by the example of their precursors. They would all have been 12 or 15 years older than my son, who would by this means have been placed between two generations in all their advantages, maturity, experience, and prudence above him, youth, promptitude, and activity below him.